Okay, so already we can kind of see that stories shape us. So let's now talk a little bit about the future and what the future is. So, if we think about it, the future doesn't actually exist. And I know that's a big statement coming from people, from someone who spends their career talking about futures, but it doesn't. It's a construct that allows us to talk about things that haven't happened. We can even say that the future is perhaps a story, or we could say it's a collection of stories because what we might think will happen will be different for everybody. And it might be different at different kind of points of our life. But this future story, this story that we have in our mind of what we think might happen, is really important and quite often goes unexamined. And whether it is sort of pessimistic or optimistic or a bit of both or changes, it's really important for us to understand that it impacts a lot of decisions that we make. If you think about it, like, do we invest in planting trees that will only fruit in 10 years if we think that climate change will be inhospitable for those trees to be planted? Do we feel the urgency to curb our actions if we think that technology is actually going to solve a lot of our problems? So the stories that we have in the future don't get examined much. So that is a little bit of what we are going to be doing today. But before we get into that activity, I just want to do a few definitions. I'm sorry, this is such an academic thing to do, to define things, but I feel the need to do it because often we use story, narrative, and myth as kind of the same thing. And in my head, they're a little bit different. And I think they're an important distinction. So for me, a story is a description of relationships with time and with place attached. So if we think about a metaphor or an analogy, that's a description of relationships, but a story is a little bit different. A narrative is a description of relationships that are common in many stories. So if we think about a story as a single unit, a narrative is when a lot of those stories feel the same. So something like life is short, live in the now. There's a lot of stories that that use that narrative. And it's also important to note that there are also often counter narratives for every narrative. And lastly, there's meta narratives or myths. And these are stories that are really ingrained in us, so ingrained that we often believe that this is just how the world works. But let's talk about stories a little bit more and bees. So stories are uniquely human, right? And thanks part to our ability to speak in language. And stories are different from communication. So many animals communicate. My son has just been learning about bees in school, and he was telling me very proudly that bees can communicate where the pollen is to other bees by doing this little dance with their bottoms to indicate the direction of the pollen. But this is quite different from the ability to tell a story of, I was out getting the pollen, and then this crazy woman tried to pick the flower that I was on, and this is how I escaped. And if we think about it, this extra knowledge is really useful because it is through stories that we can learn from the experience of others without having to go through them. In fact, our brains are so wired for stories that when we're listening to a story, our brain patterns actually mirror that of the storyteller. I think that's really crazy. Also, I'm sure you've also experienced that feeling when we're really engrossed in a story and we feel like we're transported to another world. Now, the academic term for this is, in fact, narrative transportation. And this happens because our brain has this ability called dual ipseity, which is we can both be lost in another world, experiencing that in our imagination, whilst also knowing that we are safe at home. It's pretty cool. Lastly, stories can release brain chemicals. So not only are our neurons firing in the same way, but we're also releasing chemicals like oxytocin or cortisol, or invoking kind of empathy responses and even driving us to action. And so, what it's important to realize is that stories are everywhere and we are primed to respond to them more than facts or statistics. And in part, this is because we have two ways of processing information, analytically and experientially. And studies have showed that in times of uncertainty, when the future is probably the most uncertain thing that we can manage, we tend to rely on our experiential knowledge over our analytical knowledge. Okay, narratives. So, if we think about these stories on an evolutionary scale, this ability to share stories and change beliefs and behaviors becomes really useful. And we can learn survival strategies from other people's experiences. We can also share this knowledge as a group really quickly. And if we look around the world, we can see this as evidence in different kind of cultural stories. There are many narratives that are common to certain cultures, Western cultures, capitalist cultures, like you must be as productive as possible to get ahead. You can achieve your dreams if you just work hard enough. And you can see these kind of challenged in other cultures. A friend of mine has been doing a PhD in Buon Fever. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but it's an understanding of the good life that comes from South America. And I just thought I'd share one quick story, which I love. I think is a really good example of this, which is, and I think it's probably been passed down many, many times. It's probably not true, but it's a good story, which is about an American going to Mexico and going and holidaying in a fishing village. And this businessman saw the fishermen go out in the morning, catch a few fish, come back at lunchtime, sell a few, and then have a nap, and then go play cards with his friends. And the American said, look, but if you just fished more, you could sell more, you could get another boat, you could hire other fishermen, and then you would have this big business. And the fisherman said, to then do what? And the man said, do whatever you like. And he said, yeah, well, then I just have a nap and play cards with my friends. And I think this is kind of a nice example of when narratives sort of get into our heads in different cultural contexts. Okay, so lastly, meta narratives. So meta narratives or myths, we can kind of think about these as global assumptions about how the world works. And in a way, these myths have so infiltrated our psyche that we just widely hold them to be the truth about the world. And it's difficult to question them without sounding fairly crazy, which I'm going to do anyway. So some examples of meta narratives include the idea that we need money to live, or even just money as a thing. If we think about money, we know that it is a story, that it means nothing without the story behind it. Because if you gave a $50 note to a monkey or a banana, monkey's going to take the banana, because without the story, money doesn't mean anything. Other big meta narratives are borders, that countries need them, or that people whose job creates profit should be paid more than people whose job is a community service. There's lots of these things that we just come to understand is how the world is, but is not necessarily the case. Okay, so I just thought I would share with you some interesting, I termed this slide future faults. That's probably a little bit harsh. I just kind of fell into the alliteration trap. But these are just some of the things that we tend to see when people tell us the futures that they imagine, that I thought was interesting to share. So the first one is more of the same. So in a lot of futures, we will see people say the future is more of like the present, the future is like the present, but with more of whatever is happening at the moment. So when they did a study of this at the Manoa School in Hawaii around the time of September 11, everyone imagined that the future would have more terrorism in it. I did it with some students in 2020, and we imagined that the country was going to have all these natural disasters. So we tend to see whatever we see in the present and exaggerate it more. Did anyone have anything like that in their future that they, if you're brave enough, put it in the chat? yeah. The second thing that we didn't actually get to do, but is interesting if you ever want a chance to do. You wrote worse than this. That's amazing. So the other thing that's quite interesting that we find, and I find this very interesting every time I do this example with my students, is that if I ask them to imagine, themselves in the future, and then I ask them to imagine society in the future, they will come up with things that do not resemble each other at all. And we like to call it the white picket fence in hell. So in 20 years in the future, they're having this lovely life, retired and gardening, but in their imagining of society, everything is falling apart. So that's another kind of future fallacy that's quite interesting. The other one is science fiction. So, did anyone have any elements in their future that they think that they've probably taken from a science fiction film somewhere? Anyone? Oh, AI. Okay, that's probably from a film, Carolyn, is it? Or from media articles? Anyone have any science fiction things slipping in there? Mad Max. Yeah,
Yeah,
cool.
I also had maybe some science fiction, Claire.
Yeah, yeah, it's really common. And if we think about why it's common, it's that we're asking when we're asked to imagine futures, we're asking our brain to do a
Yeah,
lot of work, right? So it's taking
I think
shortcuts. Yeah.
I think all of
Sorry.
us involved in this field, like of more techy environments and the AI taking over, is really, guiding us in a way to think of a future of an AI storm. This is what I wrote, at least.
Interesting. Okay, I want to hear more about that future a bit later. So I hope you share it.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
definitely.
okay, good, good. So yeah, so that's why we have it, and it's nothing really terrible. Ministry for the Future is Kezia. Did I pronounce your name wrong? Apologies if I didn't. Um, I found that book very powerful and informing a lot of what I think about the future. So, great book.
I
And the
agree.
last one that I want. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I agree with Christina. AI will take over, but it's not really the AI, but fallacies and the flaws of humans in not really properly and effectively proper oversight that's going would lead to accidents. I don't know. Yes, AI take
Well,
over, but we also have a certain role to play. Thank you.
Basia, I'm again sorry if I mispronounced your name, but we
It's
could do
Basir.
a whole session on the narratives around AI. It is fascinating what we do with AI from a narrative point of view. We anthropomorphize it, we give it its own agency. It's really fascinating. But I feel like that would take us vastly off topic for today. So I'm just going to continue, and maybe that's the next workshop that we do. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is dators for generic futures. If you're a futures person, you're probably familiar with them. But they are growth, collapse, constraint, and transformation. And how they came up with this was Jim Data, who's a famous futurist, and a team of researchers analyzed all the future stories that were out there and thought that they could kind of be categorized into these four generic futures. And what's really interesting is that if we think about it from an ecological point of view, they're really just patterns of change. Everything goes through these kind of stages of growth, constraint, collapse, and kind of transformation. I like to think of like things turning into compost, they kind of transform into a different thing. Now, when I started doing futures work, I really saw a lot of continued growth narratives, especially among my students. And quite worryingly, I think in the last couple of years, I've really seen collapse narratives take hold, where people are really just imagining the kind of end of days. So I would encourage you when we go to the section on reauthoring to really see if you can lean into transformation for how might things be different in the future.